I have a topic. I actually have a guest caller on who I'd like to go ahead and give a little bit of background. His name is Dr. Rob Poole. He is professor of social psychiatry at Bangor University in North Wales. He is the co-director for the Center of Mental Health and Society in North Wales and honorary consultant psychiatrist at Wrexham Mailer Hospital, chair of the Royal College of Psychiatrists in Wales. Trained at St. George Hospital in London and Oxford. He's worked for many years in central Liverpool as a community psychiatrist, and he's published on a range of subjects, including a standard textbook on psychiatric interviewing with Robert Higo, and work on alcohol misuse, creativity, and mental illness, and also a range of other topics. He has another publication coming out later this year on mental health and poverty. He also notes that he's a third-generation atheist, and he says that he's never seen any point in arguing with the faithful. But he did manage somehow to stumble into a British debate about religion, spirituality, and professional boundaries in psychiatry. And he's now published a fair bit on the subject. And he's argued with George Carey, who is a former Archbishop of Canterbury, in a debate, official debate, and there was no vote, but in Rob's opinion, he won. So I'm going to go ahead and put him on, and we're going to have a little conversation about some of what he's been involved in, which focuses on the topic of prayer in therapy. So let me just go ahead and, Rob, are you on the line?
Yeah, hi, Tracie.
Hi. I really appreciate you coming on tonight. I know it's a little bit late for you.
It's not quite past my bedtime yet.
Okay, well, good. And so let me just give a little quick background on how I got in touch with you. I was actually doing some research for a podcast on godless bitches, and I was looking into pharmacists' refusal to fill prescriptions based on religious objections. And I found a paper that you had posted, or that was posted that you had written, that you described as a written version of your, I guess, presentation in the debate with the Archbishop. And I contacted you about that issue, but then as we started corresponding, I became aware of another issue that you were involved in specifically that had to do with the Royal College of Psychiatrists, which is the professional association for psychiatry in the UK. And you were involved in publishing a debate that was ongoing with, the then chair of the Spirituality and Psychiatry Special Interest Group at the college, Chris Cook, who took the against position on, I forget exactly how it was expressed, but that prayer and therapy probably shouldn't happen. And you took the for, that you didn't think it should be happening in the therapy setting. Would you like to go ahead and give a little background on your history with this?
Yeah, as you say, I'm a third-generation atheist, but I've never really thought that made much difference as far as my practice of psychiatry was concerned. It's always seemed to me that you accept patients as they come, and that you shouldn't really impose your personal beliefs upon them. You should stick with really what's scientifically sustainable. And but I was quite discomforted from about 1999 that there was this very large group formed within the Royal College of Psychiatrists called the Spirituality and Psychiatry Special Interest Group, which was devoted to studying the interface between the two, and it was okay. I mean, it seemed an odd thing to have within a sort of scientific profession, but nonetheless, that's fine. You know, they weren't doing anything that I really felt particularly concerned about. Things really came to a head when the college has a house journal, which is available in libraries across the world, but it's called The Psychiatrist now. It used to be called the Psychiatric Bulletin. And they had an invited editorial by a guy called Harold Koenig. Harold Koenig is a psychiatrist who works at Duke University, which I think is North Carolina. Mm-hmm. And he's published an enormous amount about religion and spirituality and medicine in general. And he's published what is, if you like this kind of stuff, a standard textbook. And he did this invited editorial, and it said a number of things that I thought were really quite disturbing. It said, for example, that every patient should have a spiritual history taken from them, whether they wanted to have one taken or not. Now, you've got to bear in mind things are very different in the UK to the United States. Some estimates of the number of people who have no faith at all in this country vary from about 25% to about 50%. So, insisting on taking a spiritual history from everybody is a kind of funny thing. It said that psychiatrists should be prepared to support healthy religious beliefs and challenge unhealthy ones, which I felt, well, who decides? And finally, it said that under certain circumstances, it was permissible to pray with patience. At which point, I have to say, my personal reaction was, whoa, hang on a minute.
Sure.
So I kind of checked out how some of my colleagues felt about this. I spoke to a number of people I work with some of whom had a religious faith and some of whom didn't. And pretty much all my friends agreed with me, and I don't think I'd intimidated them into that. I think they genuinely agreed. And so we wrote a letter to the as it was, Psychiatric Bulletin, saying this is out of order. And after that, all hell broke loose.
Yes, it did.
I should say, just to be for completeness, the thing that really gave this article by Koenig a bit of a twist was that there was a invited commentary that supported what was said, written by the then president of the Royal College of Psychiatrists, who is someone with a strong religious faith, and I felt that made it seem as if it was Royal College of Psychiatrists policy. So it's been a kind of an escalation over the years, but it was really that thing in 2008 that got us going.
Now, wasn't it there one point where Prince Charles was actually dragged into this somehow?
Oh, yes. Well, there is I dragged Prince Charles into it.
Okay.
I have to say, we're not personally acquainted, but I did drag him into it. Well, there's a kind of a side plot, because I don't know how much people know about Prince Charles. He is going to be the next monarch, apparently, in this country. And Prince Charles is a strong believer in various alternative therapies, kind of alternative religious practices and so forth. And back in 1991, I think it was 1991, he became the patron of the Royal College of Psychiatrists. I don't know why he did that, because he proceeded, when they first made him patron, he spoke to the annual conference and really said that we should all be embracing alternative therapies and a variety of other things. Basically the assembled group of psychiatrists looked on in horror as he told us that we should be really sort of tree hugging, I suppose. But Prince Charles has kind of continued, despite the fact he's in this position of patronage of our college, has promoted various alternative therapies, and in fact, he manufactures, his company manufactures herbal remedies, which at one point had to be taken off the market because they broke the law as far as false claims was concerned for efficacy.
Problems. Sure.
And yet he has promulgated this idea that somehow we should be bringing religion closer with psychiatry. So Prince Charles is over in the corner there. Okay.
But I didn't mean to drag you off course. So please go on with what was happening here, because now it's my understanding you had directed me to a debate that was published in the British Journal of Psychiatry, and I remember going and reading that and being frustrated, I guess, with the responses to some of the challenges that you were bringing up, because I felt like they weren't being directly addressed, and I felt that part of the weakness in the responses to you is that you actually, you don't have the opinion that a person who might benefit from a prayer group or from some sort of spiritual framework or religious framework in their therapy should be denied that. It's simply that your position is that it should be provided by a religious framework and not in psychiatry.
Absolutely right. I think if you want religion, you choose the person of a religious denomination of your choice, and you go and speak to them.
Right.
It seems to me that getting that from your psychiatrist or from your therapist is entirely wrong. Psychiatry is underpinned by applied science. It's not a perfect science. Religion is a matter of faith. They're completely different things, and they shouldn't be mixed. In terms of what happened, what happened was, firstly, it was interesting because at think it's fair to say that the spirituality and psychiatry group are quite a broad church, so to speak. There's quite a variety of opinion within it. But many of the people within it who wrote against me, because there's been correspondence going backwards and forwards and so forth, tried to suggest that I was suggesting that psychiatrists should never mention anything about religion. Well, that isn't true at all. I mean, people who are with serious mental illnesses often are very troubled by religious ideas, and you have to engage with them. It's doing religion.
Right.
It's actually doing religion as part of the therapy that I think is completely beyond the professional boundary. So we ended up, anyway, the debate that was published in the British Journal of Psychiatry, it's 2 years ago now. This is something that's done quite regularly by the British Journal of Psychiatry. They have a debate article. So Chris Cook, who is actually still the chairman of the Spirituality and Psychiatry Special Interest Group, and I batted backwards and forwards as to whether prayer was acceptable within the context of standard psychiatric practice. I'd have to agree with you. I mean, of course, just like I believe I won the debate with George Carey, I believe I won the debate with Chris Cook as well. You see a pattern developing, which may not be entirely related to my rhetorical skills so much as my vanity, but still.
Right.
I felt it was quite difficult to actually pin him down. Chris Cook is actually someone I know very well. He's a nice guy. I went to medical school with him, actually. He's a professor of psychiatry, and he's also an ordained Anglican minister. Oh, actually ordained by George Carey, as it turned out. Okay. But he was very difficult to pin him down. So, I mean, one of the points he made, which I really felt kind of illustrated a failure on the other side to engage with the real issues, was, well, what about if I pray without speaking? Does that count? And it just seems to me to be a kind of reductio ad absurdum type argument. Where if you pray and someone doesn't know you're doing it, that's fine.
Well, I liked, if I can interrupt for a minute, I really liked your retort to that, which was it's no different than engaging in a sexual relationship with a patient would be inappropriate, but you might not be able to stop yourself thinking about it. Exactly. So you were like, as a human being and just being human, I might have thoughts about a patient, but if I act on that, that's when I've breached the ethical protocols.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so to me, it's relatively straightforward. Now, I have to say that I think I'm coming from a place that's quite different from the atheist experience, because it isn't that I'm actually arguing against religion. My position is look, let's be tolerant. Let's respect diversity and not try and thrust our own beliefs down other people's throats. But I mean, one of the difficulties is that the other side of the debate, so Chris and George Carey, actually, George Carey, I never really expected to speak in any way, shape or form to a former Archbishop of Canterbury, but George Carey said to me, well, he said, Rob, I've wanted to meet you for ages, which kind of slightly spooked me. And he said that I have to say I agree with nearly everything you said. To which I had to say, no, you don't agree with me. I mean, it's nice of you to say so, but you really don't agree with me. So there's this kind of argument that spirituality is a universal human experience, and that it subsumes all types of meaning and aesthetic appreciation, which, as an atheist, is a position I really object to. I mean, one of the things, speaking as myself now, not as a psychiatrist, but I always get quite cross at the idea that somehow the only way of finding meaning in life is in some way spiritual, or which means to me supernatural.
Well, I'd like to just insert that I even saw in some of the reading that I was doing, and I was reading a lot last night, some of the reading I was doing, somebody mentioned something about some atheists. They actually phrased it that way. Some atheists, don't consider themselves spiritual. And the thing that made me kind of chuckle about that is that when I was a fundamentalist Christian, I didn't consider myself spiritual. And I know for a fact that there are theists who do not consider themselves spiritual and who are offended by that suggestion. Because you had mentioned in the debate that the Anglican tradition is more liberal and broad, Whereas there are other traditions, and I think you actually were going outside of Christianity, but I'm going to say that within Christianity, there are other positions that are more tied to doctrinal correctness. And they are offended at the idea of this liberal Christian ideology because they feel it is a complete error and an offensive error. So it's not just atheists who have a problem with being labeled as spiritual. There are theists who have a problem with this.
Well, Chris Cook, in one of his articles that's nothing to do with me, in fact, he's written a book. He's also written a book about it, which incidentally, he edited a book about religion and psychiatry, which was published by the Royal College of Psychiatrists. Says, well, it's better to speak about spirituality because it's a less loaded term than religion. Which kind of, to me, kind of nails it.
And yet the problem is, when they're trying to pray in practice, that's not spirituality, that is religious exercise.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Although I'm not quite sure what spirituality means. I mean,
well, they defined it as including or encompassing religion, but they're doing this bait and switch where they're selling this sort of overarching concept of this ethereal, ill-defined spirituality, and they have a section on their little website that I linked on the blog that says what is spirituality, and if you read it and you still don't know, then you're in the same boat I am, because I read that section and I still don't know. And but they have this idea that, we'll use spirituality and pull away from religion because we don't want to get specific and exclusive, and so we'll use spirituality, but then prayer and therapy is religious practice. It's not separate from religion in some kind of overarching way. It is religion, straightforward.
Well, absolutely, and it's interesting. I mean, because I've ended up, despite the fact I've always believed that there's no point in arguing with the faithful because it's just not about logic, I've ended up having lots and lots of discussions with people about it, and I'm quite a good friend actually of our hospital chaplain, and it was a very sensible person, very sensible woman, but people will not. But people from the religious side of this debate will not reject the possibility of praying with patients in the course of treatment, even whilst acknowledging that it's fraught with dangers.
Yeah, that's what I guess got to me the most, was the insistence that that somehow they are glued to this idea that the psychiatrist has to be the one that prays. And they acknowledge that it's one more area that could introduce ethical boundary problems. And yet when somebody offers a solution, which is there's already prayer groups and clerics and religious organizations that you could just find out what your patient is geared toward and recommend them to the local pastor that services that brand of Christianity or that brand of Islam or that brand of whatever they believe, send them somewhere where they would feel more affiliated and where the group already exists to do this and where they're asking to do it. It's outside your practice. It's not you doing it. You're not lending some kind of authoritarian legitimacy to their religion by doing it. And I think I sent in a letter to the Journal, and one of the questions I had was, how in the world do you implement this without stepping on somebody's religious freedom? Because you're going to have psychiatrists who have their own faith traditions that are going to then have to offer prayer to their patients who might be of another tradition. I mean, it's a mess. And then you've got the patients, and it's like the patient's going to pray with the doctor and they're all in sync, and then suddenly the doctor says something that's not quite what the patient agrees with, and now what just happened? And I couldn't see.
In fact, there's even a problem where the psychiatrist and the patient share a faith. So, and it's an example I've used in one of the things I've published about this, which is the situation where you've got someone who's severely depressed. Someone who's severely depressed, and say they ask the psychiatrist to pray with them for deliverance, and their prayer isn't answered. I would suggest there's a predictable consequence that people will feel more despairing as a consequence.
Sure.
That their sense of abandonment is likely to be heightened by the fact that the person who's trying to treat them for the depression has prayed with them and that has failed. Where does it leave one's confidence in, if you like, science-based treatments when the prayer bit has failed, which the doctor obviously has got faith in? So I think there's real pitfalls in this.
Okay, hang on just a minute. I have a host that's joined me later in the program. This is Russell Glasser, who is now here.
Hi, Rob. I'm sorry I wasn't here earlier, but there was some mix-up communication on my end. So, hi, I'm Russell.
Hi.
And I've been listening in for about 10 minutes. And I just wanted to interject something, which is that it seems to me that part of the effect of letting psychiatrists pray for the patients as in part of their official capacity is that they lend sort of an air of legitimacy to it. I was recently in a discussion with a close friend of mine who I won't mention in particular, but this friend was talking about going to a chiropractor, and it was news to her that chiropractomancy isn't considered like mainstream medicine. And she pointed out, well, insurance companies cover it, so why would they do that if it's not legitimate medicine? And I looked it up, and they do, and they say, well, it has some therapeutic value like massage, but it's still not medicine. But the effect of this was to kind of muddy the waters, to sort of
legitimize it.
To legitimize it, to give the impression that it's real science of some sort. And I feel like this would be much worse if a practicing psychiatrist who has a degree, a medical license, would do this in their official capacity, right?
Well, I'd agree with that. Although I think the evidence is that this stuff is fairly common in the US, in fact. Because as far as we have much evidence about them, there is an evidence gap which we're trying to do something about.
Yeah, how much would you like us to apologize for what happens in the US?
Well, I wouldn't get you to start with the psychiatrist praying with the patients.
Okay.
But anyway, I think it's reasonably common. There's an interesting comparison with the US and the UK. In the UK, I don't know, but I wouldn't be at all surprised to find that psychiatrists, by and large, are more religious than the general population. We know that the situation is reversed in the US. And it's actually a minority of psychiatrists who have a religious faith in America. Mm-hmm. But nonetheless, even back 20 years ago, an American psychiatrist did a survey of, there was some within the American Psychiatric Association, there was a Christian group, and he surveyed them, and one of the things, that a third of them said that they would be prepared to counsel non-believers on issues such as sex outside of marriage, abortion, and so forth, on the basis of their religious faith that wasn't shared by the patient. So, I think certainly 20 years ago, this would have been regarded as seriously out of order in the UK. So there's a difference in practice, and it is a complicated one.
Yeah, I mean, just from my own experience, I would be completely stunned and taken aback if I went into any kind of professional therapist's office, not just a psychiatrist, and they mentioned or approached me about religion when I hadn't brought it up. I would find that to be extremely weird. My husband, who I've mentioned briefly on a few occasions on the show, is a theist, and when I brought this up to him when you and I first started corresponding, he said that he would walk right out of a therapist's office if they started talking about prayer and therapy.
Well, the interesting thing is that no one's really bothered to ask the patients about this much. What they ask people is, would you like your religion taken into account in your treatment? And they say yes, and
sure.
Of course you would. Take it into account.
Right.
When you actually ask people about whether you want the psychiatrist to pray with you, people tend to react with that same kind of horror.
Right, it is horrifying.
No, when we said taken into account, we meant, would you like us to say voodoo spells instead of operating on you?
Well, again, there's a guy, a psychiatrist called Richard Sloan, who's written the standard book about religion and medicine. He happens to be a psychiatrist who working in New York. He apparently, according to his book, it's quite common for American surgeons to pray with patients in the anaesthetic room, which I have to say wouldn't give me great faith in their confidence in the surgery, but I don't know.
We do get letters from people describing things like that because of our work with TAE. So people write to the show and they'll say, something like this happened to me. But I will say that, they write to us because they're stunned that it happened. So I do think that this is still kind of a shocking thing, even in the U.S. I wouldn't expect. My husband had a bout with cancer that went on for a lot of years. We had a lot of meetings with surgeons, on all kinds of doctors. Nobody prayed with us. Nobody asked us to pray. No nurses, nobody that worked in the clinics. No one ever suggested such a thing, and I would consider it completely unprofessional. And we never ran into that. But we do get letters, again, at TAE from people who say that they did encounter things like this in their doctor's office.
Well, we've been running some field trials of some research where we've been meeting with groups of people and putting little vignettes about, this is research actually I'm doing with Chris Cook. Mm-hmm. So Chris Cook and I are doing this research together. And we've got these vignettes and we put them to people, and it's interesting that you get quite varied responses to various vignettes, but the praying with people people tend to see it as definitely out of order, or even the suggestion of it, actually.
Yeah, and I just, like I said, I just keep coming back to the idea that if they want to pray, nobody's telling them they can't pray, and nobody would deny them help in getting a prayer group to, or a cleric or somebody who could help them. I mean, the idea of just referring them to someone that can help them with that, I think, is perfect. Because it just, you're not getting involved with it. You're still practicing what you're trained to practice. And the cleric does his thing and helps the person who says that they are affiliated with this or that religious tradition, and they go there and get whatever support they need from that. I mean, it just seems like such a reasonable solution to a problem or to something that could be just fraught with issues.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes there can be complications, but it works. In my many years working in central Liverpool, where it was a very, very diverse population, I worked with the local imam, with local priests, with staff from both cathedrals, and it wasn't a problem.
Right.
And they did their stuff and I did mine. Right. And interestingly, none of the clergy I've ever worked with have ever felt any need to work on the antidepressant treatment or give advice to their what do you call them, congregations about psychiatric treatment. So I don't see where's the difficulty. If they don't want to do that, I don't want to do the other bit really.
Right. No, I think it makes perfect sense. I can't imagine. That's what makes me wonder what the objection is. I mean, I cannot put my finger on what the objection is to simply referring the person.
I think one of the things that is striking is that this has become increasingly prominent as a kind of a cause célèbre as the Church of England has found itself in a weaker and weaker position. Mm-hmm. And one of the interesting things about George Carey, who is now, he wasn't we've had two, we're on our second Archbishop of Canterbury since George Carey left. But George Carey has been a vociferous proponent of having a distinctive Christian culture in this country. He's kind of opposed to diversity. And I think that's kind of an indication of, if you like, established Christianity losing its grip on British national life. I think that's part of why we see this. I think that isn't the only bit. I think that no doubt there's been a big fuss in America about DSM-5. There's been a big fuss here about DSM-5. People tend to see DSM-5. Mm-hmm. I mean, I have to say, I think DSM-5 is a disaster.
Can I stop you for a minute? Could you please, for our viewers, explain what the manual is?
Oh, right, okay. So this is the American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, 5th edition. And it's essentially grossly expanded the number of disorders that you might suffer from. It's actually quite difficult not to have a mental disorder if you read DSM-5. You're quite likely to end up with 5 or 6 if you read it, which is okay. I mean, well, it's not okay at all, actually. But one of the things that has driven criticism of DSM-5 has been the argument that psychiatry has become very, very decontextualized, lacking in a psychological or social element, very much about medications and illnesses. Now, I think it's a widespread perception that this has happened in psychiatry, and I think that there is a part of this that is an attempt to reclaim meaning. However, in the UK, I'm not sure that we've gone quite as far down the biological path that people have gone down in America. So, for example, as a mainstream psychiatrist, I've got lots of psychotherapy training. I had to do it in order to qualify as a psychiatrist. I do psychotherapy with people, but nonetheless, there's this perception that we've lost a grip on meaning, and then there's kind of almost a knee-jerk thing that says, well, meaning means spirituality, and then you're off down this path, really. So I think there's more than one thread, or more than one pressure that's making people think that this is a good idea, but it's not.
Yeah. And so ultimately, I guess where this has ended up is that the research that you were talking about with you and Chris Cook being involved, the Royal College has decided to sort of table this until there's more information. Is that kind of a...
No, not at all.
No, okay.
No. The Royal College, a position paper was written that went through the machinery of the Royal College. Essentially, it's a bit of an anodyne paper because it got kind of edited by numerous committees, but it does say that we should spirituality should be taken into account. It's very unclear what this means, and that went through after all this started. I have to say, no one asked me, but I'm not entirely surprised by that. So I kicked up a bit of a fuss about the fact that this seemed to have gone through without reference to the concerns that have been expressed. And so I made this proposal that Chris and I should do some research together, which, no one's neutral about religion. So the alternative is to have a balanced leadership of the research. And that's got the support of the Royal College, and I have to say we've got some interest from our General Medical Council, which is the body that licenses doctors in the UK. It takes a long time to do this stuff. We're developing the methods, but at least we've got a chance of developing some empirical data about it in the long run.
Okay, and I have one other question. Now, you had, as part of your work previously, you were involved in investigating, I guess, ethical questions or complaints about practices in other psychiatrists. Is that correct?
That's something I do to now, yes.
Okay, and you said that at one point you had more complaints about religious breaches of boundaries than sexual breaches of boundaries. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's true. I've come across that more frequently. Now, you may say, well, I would, because I've got an issue about it, but the fact is that in my personal experience, it's been much more common that people have complained about
right. I mean,
this
wasn't just you doing investigations like the Inquisition. This was complaints being brought forward, correct?
No, these are things that have got to the point where someone had made a formal complaint to one body or another.
Sure, and you're just simply saying that the number of complaints you got regarding the religious breaches were pretty numerous compared to some other things.
But the sexual ones were very few and far between.
Okay.
I mean, very few and far between. But the religious ones were rather more common.
Okay. Yeah, and I remember one, just to mention real quickly, there was one that you wrote up where a particular doctor had started taking referrals from a local church, I guess, or a local cleric instead of through the proper channels or the normal channels. He was taking a lot of referrals, and one of those referrals he agreed to only treat this patient if their spouse was in the room.
That's correct.
And it turned out that their spouse was abusing them, and the patient couldn't speak to the doctor because the spouse was present in the therapy.
That's correct.
And they were unsuccessfully treated for depression for a great long time until ultimately someone found out there was a greater problem, and they switched doctors to a doctor that wasn't tied to that faith, and he then found out that there was some major abuse happening in the relationship.
Yeah, all that happened. Although I have to say that was some years ago, but some long time ago. But yeah, that did happen. Yeah.
But I just want to point out the problems that are encountered here, and you've had other problems where the patients prayed with their doctors, and then afterwards the patient was like, maybe I shouldn't have done that, and then they felt uncomfortable.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, so you couldn't really leave it to a patient to say they're okay with this, because this is a person seeking help, and this is an authority, and after the fact they may say, I regret that, and it was a bad decision, and yet that's where the doctor is supposed to step up and say this might not be a good idea.
Well, you see, people have all kinds of ideas about things that might be helpful when they're mentally ill, or when they're just feeling very distressed. So, you might feel that taking very large amounts of diazepam is a good idea.
Right.
But it isn't. Right. And so you have to say no.
Sure.
And there are many examples like that. And I personally, I think getting involved with the doctor in religious practice would be one of them.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, we do have some calls on. We're going to have to, I think, cut you loose at this point. But I wanted to thank you so much for calling in and bringing this matter to our attention, and also for being willing to discuss this publicly. I just very much appreciate your time.
It's absolutely fine. Really nice speaking to you.
Thanks for joining us, Rob.
Thank you.
That's great.
All right.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.